In 1624, New York was a cluster of bark huts at the southern tip of an island the Dutch West India Company had nearly abandoned. 30 people, no roads, no walls, one product that mattered: beaver pelts. By 1898, that same island anchored a consolidated city of 3.4 million people, overnight the second largest city on Earth, behind only London, and the headquarters of more concentrated capital than any metropolis in the Western Hemisphere. Boston had been founded first. Philadelphia had been larger for most of the colonial era. New Orleans had claimed the mouth of the continent's greatest river. None of it mattered. Within a single century, New York had rerouted the trade of an entire continent through one harbor, and the money followed the goods with a precision that looked, in retrospect, like gravity. The distance between those two facts, 30 people and a fur post, and 3.4 million people and the machinery of American capital, is the story of a city that held one geographic advantage and understood slowly and then, all at once, exactly what to do with it. Chapter 1. The Harbor. Start with the water, not the city. The water came first, and the city was always secondary to it. Before there were streets, before there were walls, before there was even a name for the place, there was a harbor of a particular and almost implausible quality, deep enough to take ocean-going vessels, sheltered enough to hold them in any season, and free of ice through winters that paralyzed every other major port on the eastern seaboard. It did not require engineering. It did not require investment or vision or the ambitions of any particular man. It was a geological accident, the consequence of a glacier retreating some 12,000 years before the first European ship felt its way through the Narrows and dropped anchor in what lay beyond. What lay beyond was one of the great natural harbors on the planet. The upper bay stretched roughly 4 miles across and sat at the mouth of a river so large and so deep that early explorers sailed it for weeks before the land closed in around them. That river was the Hudson, and the Hudson was not merely a feature of the landscape. It was the landscape's organizing logic. It ran almost 150 miles northward from the harbor toward the interior of the continent, broad and navigable for most of its length, its valley cutting through the only serious break in the Appalachian mountain chain between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi. There was no comparable passage. The river ran where it ran, and the harbor waited at its mouth, and any city that sat at that junction would receive whatever the interior sent down. This is the fact that determines everything that follows. Not ambition, not character, not the peculiar energies of the Dutch or the English or the immigrant millions who came after them. Geography was the engine. The rest, the merchants, the brokers, the canal diggers, the railroad men, the tower builders, were the people who arrived to operate it. New York did not produce the things that made it rich. It positioned itself between the things that were produced and the world that wanted to buy them. It was a pass, not a factory. It was a gateway, not a workshop. It was, from its first hour as a trading post, a place whose function was movement rather than manufacture, and that function was determined not by any decision of its founders, but by the water they chose to build beside. The harbor did not freeze. Boston Harbor could be locked in ice for weeks. Philadelphia's Delaware River went solid in hard winters, halting commerce entirely. New York kept moving. Ships that would have waited out January in other ports were loading and unloading here, earning freight revenue that compounded season after season into a structural advantage over every competitor on the coast. Up the Hudson, a merchant ship could travel more than 100 miles from the open ocean and still be moving on deep tidal water. The valley threaded north and west past the Catskills, past the Adirondack foothills pointing toward the interior like a surveyor's line. The entire agricultural production of that interior, the wheat and corn and salted pork of farms that would not exist for another century, would eventually need to reach the Atlantic to reach a market. The Hudson pointed directly at the one harbor capable of receiving it. The problem, in 1624, was the distance between the river's navigable head and the Great Lakes. That distance was roughly 150 miles of upstate New York wilderness. It was not, in the end, a permanent problem, but it would take 2 centuries, a governor with an impossible idea, and a ditch 363 miles long to close it. Chapter 2. The Company Town. In the summer of 1626, a Dutch colonial official named Peter Minuit concluded an arrangement with the Lenape people, who had lived on the island of Mannahatta for generations. The exchange involved trade goods, tools, cloth, metal objects, valued by the Dutch at 60 guilders. The figure of $24 that lodged itself into American memory was a conversion calculated more than 2 centuries after the fact, and no contemporary Dutch record mentions beads or trinkets of any kind. What the documents do not record, and what the Lenape understanding of land almost certainly did not include, was a permanent transfer of the island from one owner to another. They understood, in all likelihood, a shared right to use a place they had always used. The Dutch understood a deed. That gap, between what each party believed it had agreed to, is the first transaction in a city that would spend the next 4 centuries conducting transactions whose full terms only one side understood. The settlement that followed was called New Amsterdam, and it was, in the plainest possible terms, a company town. The Dutch West India Company had chartered it, staffed it, and supplied it, and the company had exactly one interest in the island at the mouth of the Hudson: beaver pelts. The North American beaver had become the raw material for Europe's hat trade, the demand large enough that the company had organized an entire transatlantic operation around securing the supply. New Amsterdam was not a colony in any aspirational sense. It was a counting house with walls. Ships arrived from Amsterdam loaded with trade goods. Ships departed loaded with pelts. The gap between those 2 cargoes was the company's margin, and the margin was the only reason New Amsterdam existed. By the 1640s, fewer than 500 people lived at the island's southern tip, a disorganized scatter of wooden buildings behind a crude fortification, its politics fractious, its population composed of merchants, soldiers, servants, and the kind of adventurers who end up at the edges of colonial ventures because they have worn out their welcome everywhere else. The harbor was excellent. The management was not. Enter Peter Stuyvesant. He was a Friesland-born soldier who had served the company in the Caribbean, where he lost his right leg in an assault on the Portuguese-held island of St. Martin in 1644. Not a metaphorical wound, an actual amputation, the leg replaced by a wooden peg, the contemporaries describe him tapping against floors and docks as rhythmic punctuation to his temper. He arrived in New Amsterdam in May of 1647 as the new Director General, sent to bring order to a settlement whose own population had petitioned Amsterdam for relief. He was hard, autocratic, theologically rigid. He governed New Amsterdam for 17 years, and in that time he surveyed streets, required fences, and grudgingly established civic institutions. He did not make the colonists love him. He made the colony function. In 1653, Stuyvesant ordered a defensive wall built across the northern edge of the settled town, a palisade of wooden planks, 12 feet high, intended to deter attack from the English colonies to the north. A lane ran beside it on the southern side, a passage wide enough for carts and foot traffic, following the wall's line from one shore to the other. The wall served its purpose for a decade and then became irrelevant, not because it was destroyed, but because the town grew past it. By the time the English arrived in force, the wall was already more symbol than defense. Keep that lane in mind. the wall came down. The name of the lane did not. It kept the word, Wall Street, long after the planks had been pulled for timber, and the ditch filled, and the northern edge of the town had moved a mile up the island. The lane that ran beside a colonial palisade built to keep out the English would one day set the price of the world. But that is 2 centuries away. In the summer of 1664, an English fleet of 4 warships entered the Narrows and anchored in the upper bay. Stuyvesant climbed to the fort's ramparts, looked at the ships, and then looked at his town. He had 150 soldiers, fewer than 300 pounds of gunpowder, and cannons the company had not maintained. When he asked the citizenry to sign a petition against surrender, they declined with such unanimity that the petition came back with fewer names than he could defend the fort with. He tore it up, by the accounts that have survived, in visible fury. Then he walked down from the ramparts and negotiated the terms. The flag changed. New Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York, the brother of the English king. The company's counting house passed to the crown. The beaver pelts kept moving. Chapter 3. The Merchant Port. After 1664, the flag above the fort changed again and then changed back, and then changed once more. The Dutch recaptured the town briefly in 1673, held it for a year, and surrendered it again at the peace table. Each time the harbor remained. Each time the ships kept loading. The name New York, held after the final English restoration in 1674, and with it held the essential fact of the place, that it was a port, and that being a port was enough. Through the 1700s, New York grew the way colonial ports grew, steadily without distinction, accumulating ships and warehouses and counting houses in the manner of a place that understood its function without yet grasping its potential. Philadelphia, larger and older in its civic ambitions, held more people and more prestige. Boston, with its Puritan tradition of letters and law, carried a reputation that New York, practical, commercial, indifferent to self-mythology, never bothered to cultivate. A bale of tobacco or a barrel of salted fish moved through New York, not because New York had any particular claim on it, but because the harbor was good and the merchants were willing. Geography had given New York a fine harbor. It had not yet given it a reason why that harbor had to be the one. This was the city's condition for most of a century: capable, competitive, unremarkable. Wars interrupted the trade. The 7 Years' War, then the Revolution, which closed the port for years and stalled whatever momentum the colony had accumulated. New York was occupied by the British for most of the Revolutionary conflict, and when Washington's army finally marched back in November of 1783, it entered a city whose population had shrunk, whose wharves had been stripped, and whose position among American ports had to be rebuilt from a condition close to zero. The rebuilding was quiet and fast. By 1790, the first federal census counted roughly 33,000 people in New York, enough to push it past Philadelphia and make it, for the first time, the largest city in the new United States. The margin was thin. The distinction meant less than it would later appear to mean: bigger, not yet decisive. Then, on May 17, 1792, 24 men gathered in Lower Manhattan. The location was the street-level air outside 68 Wall Street, in the lane whose name still carried the ghost of a palisade built 140 years earlier. The wall was long gone. What gathered in its place, under the shade of a buttonwood tree, was a compact of brokers, merchants, and auctioneers who had been trading government securities in coffee houses and on street corners since the Revolutionary War's debt had created a market for them. The document they signed was 2 sentences. They agreed to trade only with each other. They agreed to fix the commissions they charged their clients. No ceremony, no founding address, no name for what they were doing. 24 signatures under a tree on a lane that used to be a wall. It was, by any accounting of the moment, a small thing. The securities they traded were modest. The market they controlled was narrow. There were larger exchanges in London, in Amsterdam, in every capital that had been managing public debt for longer than the United States had existed. The Buttonwood Agreement made no claim to be anything other than what it was, a convenience, a way for a group of traders to reduce the cost of doing business with each other by eliminating the open cry auctions that anyone could attend and undercut. Keep those 24 names in mind. The tree would be gone within a decade. The lane would be paved and repaved, the buildings on either side torn down and rebuilt and torn down again taller each time. But the compact, trade among ourselves, fix the price, would survive every demolition, outlast every building on the street, and grow, through war and panic and the acquisition of a continent's worth of industrial capital, into the institution that set the price of the country. Not yet. In 1792, it was a market in government bonds under a tree. The harbor was still what mattered. The canal had not been dug. The great rerouting had not begun. But on Wall Street, in the lane where a wooden wall once stood, something had started. Chapter 4. Clinton's Ditch. DeWitt Clinton was a New York-born lawyer and politician who had served as a United States Senator and as mayor of New York City before arriving at the governorship in 1817, with an idea that most of his contemporaries considered reliable evidence of a disordered mind. The idea was a canal, not a short channel connecting two nearby rivers, not a modest cut to bypass a rapids, but a canal 363 miles long, across the entire width of upstate New York, through forest and swamp and limestone ridge, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. Clinton had been promoting it since at least 1810. He had lobbied Congress for federal support and been refused. He had heard Thomas Jefferson describe the project as a century premature. Along the way, he had collected the phrase that would follow him: Clinton's ditch, Clinton's folly. He was not wrong, and he appears to have known it with the stubbornness of a man who has done the arithmetic and found that the arithmetic leads somewhere specific. The Hudson ran northward from New York Harbor to Albany, 150 miles of deep navigable water connecting the Atlantic directly to the Appalachian Plateau. The Great Lakes lay west of Albany, across a flat glacial plain, draining the agricultural basin of a continent in waiting: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Between Albany and the lakes lay the Mohawk Valley, one of the few places on the eastern seaboard where the Appalachian chain dropped low enough to cross without exceptional engineering. The pass existed. The question was whether a channel could be dug to carry boats and the ton-loads of grain that Western farms would eventually need to ship east. The state of New York authorized $7 million for the project in 1817 with no federal assistance and no precedent of comparable scale anywhere on the continent. The engineers who broke ground that July were not, in the main, trained engineers in any formal sense. They were surveyors and self-taught mechanics working out the practice in the field. They made errors. They corrected them. They dug. What they dug was not a metaphorical ditch, an actual ditch, 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, 363 miles from one end to the other, with 83 locks to manage the elevation changes between the Hudson Valley and the lake. Most of it cut by hand, by Irish immigrants and upstate New York farmers working with shovels, wheelbarrows, and horse-drawn scrapers through 8 summers and autumns, through forests, through limestone ridges, through the black muck of lowland swamps that swallowed equipment and sickened the men. It did not curve around the wilderness. It went through it, straight and deliberate, in a way that only a project backed by state authority and $7 million could afford to be. Clinton lost the governorship in 1822 to opponents who had made the canals cost their argument. He was returned to office in 1824 by an electorate that had watched the first completed sections carry traffic and seen, in the reduced cost of moving goods, what the finished project was going to mean. He was still governor when it opened. October 26, 1825. Clinton stood at the western terminus at Buffalo as a ceremonial flotilla set out east along the finished canal, lock by lock, through towns that had organized celebrations at every stop, cannon fire and crowds and speeches. 9 days later, the boats reached the Hudson at Albany and continued south to New York Harbor. There, Clinton poured a keg of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean in a ceremony he called the Wedding of the Waters. The ditch was dug, 363 miles, 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, with 83 locks holding the water in its course across a wilderness that had no reason to become anything until the channel was cut through it. Chapter 5. The Taking. The math was straightforward. Before October of 1825, moving a ton of freight from Buffalo to New York City cost about $100 and took weeks. After the Erie Canal opened, the same ton cost roughly $10 and took days. The reduction was not incremental. It was not the kind of improvement a competitor could absorb and match over a season or two. It was the kind of change that rewrites the geography of commerce permanently, because it did not merely lower the price of shipping, it lowered it below the threshold at which any overland route or rival water path could compete. Philadelphia had its turnpikes. New Orleans had the Mississippi. Boston had the sea. None of it was enough. None of it moved a ton of grain for $10. The canal did, and the canal ended at New York Harbor. What followed was not gradual. The agricultural output of the American interior, the wheat of Ohio, the corn of Indiana, the flour and salted pork of farms that had been selling their surplus to whoever would take it, found a new destination with the speed of water finding the lowest point in a landscape. New Orleans had claimed the continent's trade through the Mississippi for decades. The river ran south, and south was where the goods went. Now a cheaper, faster route ran east through New York, and east was where the goods went instead. Philadelphia lost its claim to the interior before it had time to mount a defense. New York took the trade of a continent away from New Orleans, Philadelphia, and Boston, and never gave it back. Not a metaphorical taking, an actual one, measurable in cargo manifests and customs receipts, and the widening gap between New York's port revenues and every rival port's from the year the canal opened onward. This was the taking. It was quiet on the page, the way decisive events often are. There was no war, no decree, no treaty handing the continent's commerce to one harbor. There was a ditch, 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and then there was gravity. The goods moved where the cost pointed. The cost pointed to New York. The numbers that followed were not the numbers of a port growing in proportion to its competitors. New York held 60,515 people in 1800, the largest city in the new republic, but comparable in kind to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to Boston. By 1820, the population was 123,000, still within the range of serious rivalry. Then the canal opened, and the compound effect of diverted commerce met the compound effect of immigration through a harbor that had become the undisputed entry point to the continent's interior. By 1850, New York held 515,000 people. Philadelphia, the closest rival, held fewer than half that. The canal had not merely moved freight. Immigrants landing in New York in the 1830s and 1840s knew, through the networks of those who went before them, that the canal was the road west, that the jobs were in the interior, that New York was the gate through which the continent was entered. Ahead of them lay Buffalo, Cleveland, Chicago, cities that did not yet fully exist, waiting to be built by the same labor flooding through the same gate. New York did not keep all of it. It did not need to. It kept the margin. Every crate of wheat shipped east paid its freight through a New York broker. Every immigrant heading west provisioned in New York stores. Every bank loan made in London to finance Ohio farmland passed through New York capital markets on its way inland. The canal had turned geography into a toll road, and New York was the toll gate. The commission houses and banks and insurance firms that serviced the flow of goods grew as fast as the goods themselves, generating a financial district whose scale was determined not by the city's own production, but by the volume of commerce it processed for everyone else. New York had not made the wheat. It had made itself the only practical way to sell it. The taking was complete. Chapter 6. The Fortunes. By 1842, the island was running dry. Not metaphorically, the city had grown past its own water supply, a place of more than 300,000 people drawing from wells and cisterns, and a polluted network of springs that had never been adequate and were now in the press of tenements and tanneries and the ordinary biological waste of a dense industrial population, dangerously compromised. The solution was the Croton Aqueduct, completed that year, an engineered channel carrying fresh water roughly 40 miles south from the Croton River in Westchester County, through stone-lined tunnels and iron pipes, all the way to receiving reservoirs at what would become Bryant Park and Central Park. The city held a celebration when the water arrived. Fountains ran in the streets. The mayor drank a public toast. The harbor had given New York its opening. The canal had given it the interior. Now it reached north for the water. The lesson was the same lesson, repeated a third time. New York imports whatever its ambition outgrows. Enter John Jacob Astor, a Waldorf-born butcher's son who arrived in the United States in 1784 at the age of 20 with 7 flutes, roughly 2 pounds sterling, and a letter of introduction to a fur trader in New York. No education, no connections. What he possessed was a precise and unsentimental understanding of how money moved, and a willingness to hold a position through every fluctuation and discouragement until the market moved to where he had decided it would go. He built his first fortune in the fur trade, establishing the American Fur Company in 1808 and extending its reach west through the Great Lakes and eventually to the Pacific. When the fur market softened, he pivoted without sentiment to the thing beneath his feet. Manhattan real estate. Not the buildings on it, the land itself, leased on long terms to tenants who built whatever they required. He held it. New York grew around it. The land became worth more each year simply because the city could not stop being what it was. When Astor died in March of 1848, his estate was valued at roughly $20 million, the largest private fortune in the United States at that moment. His instructions to his heirs were almost tediously consistent with the philosophy he had practiced for 60 years. Buy land, hold it, let the city do the work. He had arrived with 7 flutes. He died the richest man in America. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a Staten Island farm boy who borrowed $100 from his mother at 16 to buy a small sailing vessel and begin ferrying passengers between Staten Island and Lower Manhattan. It was 1810. The harbor was already the busiest in the country, and the busiest stretch of it was the narrow water every merchant, every immigrant, every barrel of goods needed to cross. Vanderbilt crossed it. He crossed it steadily, competitively, and with a ferocity toward rivals that became the operating signature of everything he built. He moved from sail to steam without hesitation, from harbor ferries to coastal steamship routes, from steamships to railroads, acquiring, consolidating, cutting rates until competitors sold or collapsed, then raising them once the competition was gone. By the 1860s, he controlled the New York Central Railroad, and in 1871, he opened the first Grand Central Depot at 42nd Street, the organizing station of a rail network that tied the American interior to his harbor, his city, his capital. He was called the Commodore, a title earned in the steamship years and kept through the railroad era because it suited him. The bluntness of it, the naval command. When he died in January of 1877, his estate was appraised at roughly $100 million, approximately 1% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. One man, 1%. The water had made both of them. Astor's furs came through the harbor. His land held its value because the harbor kept the city growing. Vanderbilt's first vessel crossed the harbor. His railroads fed it. The harbor, the canal, and then the water from the Croton. Each time the city reached past its limits and seized what it required, the men who understood what drove it ran faster still. The water made them rich. The city made the water what it was. Chapter 7. The Gateway. Between 1855 and 1890, a building at the southern tip of Manhattan called Castle Garden received approximately 8 million people arriving by ship from Europe. It was not a grand structure, a converted fort, round and low, sitting at the Battery's edge, where the harbor water lapped the seawall. Immigration officials processed the arrivals there. Names recorded, destinations noted, the basic administrative machinery of a city absorbing a continent's displaced population. 8 million, in roughly 35 years. A volume that had no precedent in the movement of peoples across an ocean. And Castle Garden handled it in the same waterfront district where beaver pelts had once moved out of the city in the other direction. The federal government opened a dedicated station at Ellis Island on January 1, 1892, a small island in the upper bay that had served as an ammunition depot and, before that, as a place the Lenape had used for harvesting oysters from the harbor floor. The first Great Hall burned in 1897 and was replaced in 1900 by the French Renaissance complex of red brick towers and iron-vaulted processing rooms that still stands. From that opening until the station's closure in 1954, roughly 12 million immigrants passed through its halls: Italians, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Greeks, Hungarians, Slovaks, Syrians. The entire human geography of a European and Mediterranean world coming apart under poverty, pogroms, and the grinding pressure of industrialized economies that had no use for small farmers and village tradesmen. They came because the harbor was the entry point. They stayed because the city was building at a rate that required bodies, and bodies had arrived. They became the labor that built the towers. They sewed garments in the loft buildings above the Lower East Side, where a single block could house 1,000 people, and the cutting floors ran 16 hours a day. They laid the track, the elevated lines above the avenues, the subway tunnels cut through the schist below, the railroad approaches from the north and west that Vanderbilt's successors kept extending. They poured the concrete and drove the rivets of a city, adding stories to its skyline faster than any city had grown upward before. They built what they arrived to and were consumed by what they built. The harbor took them in the same motion it had taken the fur pelts and the canal freight, efficiently, continuously, without ceremony. In October of 1886, the Statue of Liberty was dedicated on Bedloe's Island, a 12-acre outcrop in the Upper Bay. The statue, 151 feet tall from base to torch, a gift from the French Republic intended to honor the shared democratic ideals of France and the United States, had taken years to fabricate. Its copper sheets hammered over an iron armature engineered by Gustave Eiffel. President Grover Cleveland presided. Warships anchored in the bay. Fireworks crossed the harbor. For the millions who arrived by ship in the years that followed, the statue stood at the edge of the passage before the vessels turned north into the upper bay. It stood in the same water the Dutch had first recognized as the harbor's entrance. It stood where the narrows opened, and the bay widened, and the city became visible beyond. the towers of Lower Broadway, the masts and funnels of the working waterfront, the whole compressed enterprise of a metropolis built, brick by brick and beam by beam, on the logic of this particular water. The immigrants saw it before they saw anything else of America. It was the harbor announcing itself, the through line held. The same harbor that had organized the continent's trade now organized its people. The gateway that had worked one way, outward, moving pelts and grain and manufactured goods to the world, now worked equally in the other. Trade had come through it. Labor came through it. Capital accumulated on one side. The human cost of generating that capital crossed from the other. The water did not distinguish between what it was carrying. Chapter 8, The Heart of the Money. Now, let's go back to that lane. The wall that Peter Stuyvesant built in 1653 came down long before anyone thought to record exactly when. The lane beside it stayed. Through the Dutch years, and the English years, and the Revolutionary years, and the Canal years, the name persisted, Wall Street, a strip of lower Manhattan pavement whose only monument to its origin was a word, and whose future was being assembled, one transaction at a time, by men who had no idea what they were building. In May of 1792, 24 brokers signed a 2-sentence agreement under a buttonwood tree outside 68 Wall Street, fixing commissions and trading only with each other, a private convenience, a small market in government debt. The street held no temples, no columns, no architecture commensurate with what it was becoming. It looked like what it was, a lane in a port city. By 1900, it was something else entirely. Wall Street had become the place where the price of the country was set. The New York Stock Exchange, grown from that buttonwood compact into the largest securities market on the continent, now traded not government bonds, but steel companies and railroad networks and oil concerns. The whole industrial machinery of a nation that had spent 80 years consuming a continent. The lane where a wooden wall once stood now processed, in a single trading day, the ownership claims on more capital than most European nations carried in their entire economies. The transition from palisade to exchange required a wall to be removed, a canal to be dug, a continent to be industrialized, and 108 years. It required, finally, one man. Enter J.P. Morgan. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837, the son of a transatlantic banker, he came of age in American finance at the moment railroads were consuming capital faster than any previous industry. He spent the decades after the Civil War consolidating and refinancing rail networks that kept defaulting on their obligations. Morgan was not a builder. He was an organizer of builders, a man who understood that the value of an industrial enterprise was not in any single asset, but in the structure that bound the assets together. He brought that understanding to Wall Street at a scale no one had attempted before. In 1901, he assembled United States Steel. The corporation combined Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, and 8 smaller companies into a single entity capitalized at $1.4 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. Andrew Carnegie alone received $480 million for his share. The number was not exaggeration and not metaphor. It was $1.4 billion set by Morgan, cleared through Wall Street, in the lane where a wooden wall once stood. 6 years later, the system nearly broke. In October of 1907, a cascade of bank runs and brokerage failures drove the stock exchange toward collapse. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no mechanism by which the government could inject liquidity into a panicking market. There was instead Morgan. He gathered the leading bankers and trust company presidents of New York at his private library on Madison Avenue, summoned them, kept them there, and over 3 nights assigned each institution its share of the rescue capital required to stop the collapse. He locked the doors until they signed. A private citizen in a New York townhouse without legal authority and without federal backing, halted a national financial panic through the force of his position and his refusal to accept the alternative. The Federal Reserve was created 6 years later, in 1913, in direct response to what 1907 had demonstrated, that no nation of that size could afford to rest its financial stability on one man's willingness to stay up through the night. Morgan died in Rome in March of that year. He left an estate of approximately $80 million. The lane is still there. Chapter 9. The City That Touched the Sky. The Brooklyn Bridge took 14 years to build, cost about $15 million, and killed 27 men in the process. Its chief engineer, John Roebling, died before the first tower stone was laid. A ferryboat crushed his foot at the Fulton Ferry dock in June of 1869, and tetanus took him 3 weeks later. His son Washington inherited the project and directed it for years from the caisson chambers beneath the riverbed, where compressed air kept the East River out of the foundation pits, while men worked in conditions that medicine had not yet learned to manage safely. Washington emerged with caisson disease, the bends, and spent the remaining construction years confined to a Brooklyn Heights apartment, watching the bridge's progress through binoculars, communicating his instructions through his wife. Emily Roebling learned the engineering mathematics herself. She supervised the contractors, she carried the plans. On May 24, 1883, when the bridge opened and President Chester Arthur led the official procession across it, Emily was the first civilian to cross. Not Washington, not the politicians, not the board members who had funded it. Emily Roebling, with a rooster in her lap, as a symbol of victory, walked the span that 3 members of one family had collectively given everything to build. The bridge held the longest suspension span in the world at its opening, its granite towers rising 276 feet above the river. For the first time, a fixed connection crossed the East River, binding Manhattan and Brooklyn in a way no ferryboat ever had. Then, the city climbed past the bridge. 30 years was all it took. By 1913, Frank Woolworth had paid $13.5 million in cash, not bonds, not stock, not borrowed capital, but cash, for a building at 233 Broadway that rose 792 feet above the street. The Woolworth Building was the tallest structure in the world the day it opened, holding that distinction for the next 17 years. Cass Gilbert designed it in the Gothic Revival style, its terracotta crown bristling with finials and gargoyles, its upper stories tapering toward a peak visible on clear days from miles out in the harbor. Woolworth had made his fortune on 5-cent and 10-cent retail goods accumulated across thousands of small transactions. He paid for his tower the same way, by holding on to what came in, until the total reached a number no one had previously spent on a building. A clergyman, standing in the lobby at the April 1913 dedication, called it the Cathedral of Commerce. The name fit a city that had always worshipped trade more openly than it had worshipped anything else. The city was already growing in all directions. The 1898 consolidation, a ballot measure that passed by 64,744 to 64,467, a margin so thin it would have reversed on the last few precincts, had merged Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island into a single municipal entity, Greater New York. 3.4 million people, the second largest city on Earth behind only London. The 5 boroughs did not suddenly become one culture on the day the vote was certified. They became one government. And the government was already building at the scale the new body required. Picture Lower Broadway on a weekday morning in the year 1900. The harbor below the Battery is a forest. Not the forest the Dutch had cut down in the first years of settlement, but a forest of masts and steamer funnels, dozens of vessels working in the upper bay, the Jersey waterfront dense with dock cranes and the smoke of arriving ships. The elevated railway above 2nd and 3rd and Ninth Avenues thunders overhead, sending vibrations down through the building facades at a pitch that residents of Lower Manhattan had stopped hearing the way you stop hearing a clock that runs all night. New steel towers are climbing above the church spires that used to mark the highest points on the island. Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street, which had been the tallest structure in the city within living memory, now surrounded and overtopped by the first generation of steel frame office buildings pressing upward from Broadway and Exchange Place and Cortlandt Street. A few blocks south, at the Battery and the wharves below it, a boat has just unloaded several hundred immigrants who will walk north into a city they do not yet know how to read, carrying everything they own, within a quarter-mile of the stock exchange floor, where the ownership stakes of railroads and steel mills and oil trusts are changing hands for figures that no individual immigrant will ever see. The richest square mile on the planet, and the most recently arrived. A village that the Dutch West India Company had nearly abandoned 270 years earlier, now ran the commerce of a continent. Not directed it, not participated in it. Ran it, from the harbor to the cable rooms on Wall Street, from the Woolworth Building's Gothic crown to the engine rooms of the ships working the Narrows. It had taken a harbor, a canal, a generation of immigrants, and one very thin vote. The city stood at the height of what it had made. Chapter 10. The Cost and What Remains. The wealth had a shadow. It lived a few blocks from the mansions, not across the city, not in some other borough, but a few blocks close enough that the men who built their limestone houses on Fifth Avenue could have walked to it in 20 minutes. The Lower East Side in the 1880s and 1890s was the most densely crowded neighborhood on the planet. The canal had brought a continent's trade through the harbor. The harbor had brought the immigrants. The immigrants had built the towers and sewn the garments and laid the track. This was where they lived while they did it. In 1890, a Danish-born journalist named Jacob Riis took his camera into those rooms. His book, How the Other Half Lives, assembled the photographs and the accounting, the density, the disease rates, the child mortality, the wages, the rents charged by landlords who never set foot in the buildings they owned. The city had been forcing itself not to see this for 3 decades. Riis made it impossible not to see. 21 years later, on the afternoon of March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the upper floors of the Ash Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company occupied the top 3 floors. 146 workers died in under 30 minutes. Most of them were immigrant women, Jewish and Italian, some as young as 14. The doors to the stairwells had been locked. The one fire escape bent into the courtyard under the weight of the women who reached it. Those who did not reach the stairs jumped. The building was a short walk from the courthouse, a shorter walk from Wall Street. The wealth and the cost occupied in New York the same few square miles. They always had. And then, quietly, the engine reversed. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, manufacturing began to leave. The garment lofts emptied. The printing houses moved. The harbor, which had organized the city since the day the first Dutch ship felt its way through the Narrows, began to drain. Containerized shipping required flat land in quantity, rail connections running directly to the water's edge, room for cranes and staging yards. Manhattan had none of this. The port crossed the water to Elizabeth and Newark, New Jersey, where the flat land waited and the rail connections ran. The men who had worked the Manhattan piers did not cross with it. The piers rotted. The smell of the working harbor drained out of Lower Manhattan almost without anyone noticing, the way a neighborhood loses its character before anyone can say exactly when it changed. By 1975, the bill had arrived. The richest city in America was carrying roughly $14 billion in debt. It had been borrowing to fund operating expenses for years, rolling short-term notes into longer obligations. By spring, the city had exhausted its ability to borrow. The banks declined to buy more. President Ford declined to offer federal assistance. The headline in the New York Daily News on October 30th, 1975 read, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." The city survived through federal loans and an austerity program that cut the municipal workforce and imposed a wage freeze on every city employee. Libraries closed. Firehouses closed. The subway deferred maintenance it would not catch up on for a decade. A century of growth financed on credit had produced a reckoning as unglamorous and as consequential as anything the city had ever built. What the reckoning did not produce was an ending. Wall Street still sets the price of the world, in the same lane where a wooden wall once stood. Ellis Island is a museum now, its Great Hall silent, its registry room holding photographs of the 12 million who passed through the doors. The Statue of Liberty still faces the open sea. The Brooklyn Bridge still carries traffic. Its granite towers standing at the same height above the water they stood in 1883. The Woolworth Building still wears its Gothic crown over Lower Broadway, the gargoyles crouching at the corners, the terracotta ornament intact. The Erie Canal, the ditch that rerouted a continent, is a recreational waterway now, its locks worked by tourists on rented boats. The towpath a bicycle trail through upstate towns that were built because the canal existed and have forgotten mostly that the canal is why they are there. The thing that built New York was never the land. It was never the factories, which left. It was never the garment industry, or the printing houses, or the manufacturing floors that packed into the loft buildings and then emptied out. It was the water, the way in and the way out. The ships still move through the Narrows. On any morning, from the southern tip of the island, you can watch them. Container vessels now, not the square-rigged ships of the Dutch era or the steamers of the immigrant years, but ships doing what ships have done in this water for 400 years, following the same channel through the same gap in the same coastline, the statue standing off to the left as they clear the Narrows and the upper bay opens ahead of them. The city changed its flag, its industries, and its skyline. Changed them more than once. More than anyone who lived through any single version of it could have imagined. It never changed its reason to exist. The tide comes in through the Narrows. The tide goes out.